June 19, 1944. 8:47 a.m., 90 miles west of Guam, Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vratsiu rolled his F-6F Hellcat inverted at 22,000 feet and spotted them, a formation of 50 Japanese aircraft climbing toward the American fleet. Vratsiu had been flying fighters for exactly 7 months. The enemy pilots below him had trained for 3 years. In the next 8 minutes, Vratsiu would shoot down 6 aircraft. By day's end, American pilots with an average of 180 days training would destroy 476 Japanese planes while losing only 29 of their own, a kill ratio that defied every assumption about aerial combat. The man who made this possible never flew in combat. Commander John Thatch sat in a cramped office at Naval Air Station Jacksonville in February 1943, staring at casualty reports from the Solomon Islands. In 4 months, the Navy had lost 147 pilots, men who'd trained for 18 months before reaching the fleet. Before we continue with Commander Thatch's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to Naval Air Station Jacksonville, February 1943, where Commander Thatch was about to revolutionize how America trained fighter pilots. Thatch was 38 years old from Fordyce, Arkansas, a town of 200 people where his father ran a general store. He'd graduated from Annapolis in 1927 and spent 15 years studying aerial combat with an obsession that worried his wife. He filled notebooks with diagrams. He built model planes and flew them on strings to test maneuvers. Other pilots thought he was eccentric. In 1942, his tactics saved American carriers at Midway. Now he was about to challenge the entire structure of naval aviation training. The problem wasn't courage. American pilots were brave. The problem wasn't aircraft. By 1943, the F-6F Hellcat matched or exceeded the Zero's performance. The problem was time. Japan's elite fighter pilots trained for 36 months before combat. They practiced aerobatics until they could fly inverted 1 foot above the water. They fired 1/500 practice rounds at aerial targets. They studied enemy tactics in exhaustive detail. A Japanese naval aviator was a samurai of the air, and the Imperial Navy believed this 3-year crucible was why their pilots dominated early in the war. America tried to match this approach. Pre-war Navy fighter training lasted 18 to 24 months. Pilots learned every classical maneuver: Immelmann turns, split S reversals, vertical loops, snap rolls. They studied air-to-air gunnery, navigation, carrier landings, formation flying, instrument procedures, and aerobatic precision. The training was comprehensive, thorough, and utterly inadequate for the grinding attrition of the Pacific War. Between January and May 1943, the Navy needed 800 new fighter pilots. The training pipeline could produce 340. At the Solomons, pilots were dying faster than America could train replacements. Thatch watched the statistics with growing horror. The average pilot arriving in the Pacific had 380 hours of flight time and 14 months of training. The average pilot was shot down after 40 days in combat. Lieutenant Robert Kanze was the one who made Thatch understand. Kanze was from Duluth, Minnesota, 23 years old, trained for 16 months. He'd mastered every aerobatic maneuver the Navy taught. On February 8, 1943, 4 days after reaching Guadalcanal, Kanze engaged a Zero in a classic turning dogfight, exactly what his training emphasized. The Zero turned inside him. Kanze died trying to execute a perfect Immelmann turn at 400 feet. He had time to radio one sentence: "He's so much faster in the turn." Then silence. Thatch attended 11 memorial services in February. Every dead pilot had months of training. Every dead pilot knew how to loop and roll with precision. And every dead pilot died the same way, trying to turn with a Zero. After Kanze's funeral, Thatch returned to his office and did something that would have gotten him court-martialed if anyone found out. He calculated how many training hours American pilots wasted on skills that didn't matter in combat. The answer shocked him. Of 380 training hours, pilots spent 180 hours on aerobatics and formation flying, skills that looked impressive but rarely saved lives. They spent 40 hours on instrument flying for conditions they'd avoid in combat. They spent 60 hours on navigation they'd never use because they flew from carriers with vectors from radar. Meanwhile, they spent exactly 18 hours practicing deflection shooting, the skill that actually killed enemy aircraft. Thach sat alone in his office past midnight on February 24, 1943. The smell of aviation fuel drifted through the open window. He could hear the rumble of night training flights. He opened his notebook to a blank page and wrote 4 words. Train to survive first. What he meant would destroy 120 years of military aviation tradition. Fighter pilots were the elite, the knights of the air. Their training emphasized mastery, precision, artistry. A pilot wasn't ready for combat until he'd perfected every maneuver. This philosophy made sense when wars were short and pilots were few. In the Pacific's brutal attrition, it was killing American boys faster than Japanese bullets. Thach's radical idea: stop training pilots to be artists, train them to be survivors. Cut everything that didn't directly increase combat effectiveness, reduce training time from 18 months to 6 months, triple the number of pilots reaching the fleet. Except that these pilots would be crude, unpolished, and dangerous to themselves, but equip them with tactics so effective that crude execution would still win. He spent 3 weeks building a new syllabus. He cut aerobatic training from 180 hours to 40. He eliminated advanced formation flying. He reduced navigation training to basics. He added 80 hours of gunnery, deflection shooting, high-speed tracking, snap shooting at fleeting targets. He created a new course called Survival Tactics that taught pilots one thing: how to stay alive long enough to get crude. The most controversial change was psychological. Traditional training emphasized the romance of aerial combat, the one-on-one duel, the test of skill, the honorable fight. Thach's training eliminated honor. He taught his pilots that the zero could outturn them, so never turn with a zero. He taught them that enemy pilots had 3 years of training, so never fight fair. He taught them to run, to hide, to ambush, to gang up 4 against 1. He taught them that survival wasn't cowardice, survival was the mission. On March 15, 1943, Thach submitted his proposal to the Chief of Naval Aviation, Admiral Jack Towers. The memo was 47 pages. The first sentence read, "The Navy is training pilots to die well. We should train them to live." Towers read it twice, then called Thach into his office. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Towers asked one question repeatedly: "You're telling me we can train better pilots in less time?" Thach's answer: "Not better, deadlier." Towers approved a test program. Thach had 90 days to train 1 squadron, 18 pilots, using his radical methods. If they performed well in combat, the Navy would adopt the program fleet-wide. If they failed, Thach's career was over. He selected his instructors carefully, combat veterans who'd survived, not because they were skilled, but because they were smart. Men who ran when they should, men who ambushed, men who had no ego about fighting fair. The first class reported to Jacksonville on April 1, 1943. 18 pilots, average age 21. They expected the usual: months of formation flying, aerobatic perfection, gentlemen's rules. Instead, on day 1, Thach gathered them in a hangar that smelled of hydraulic fluid and coffee. He stood on a wooden box so the whole group could see his 5-foot 8-inch frame. He said, "Forget everything you think you know about being a fighter pilot. You're not here to be knights. You're here to kill zeros and go home to your mothers." The training was brutal in unexpected ways. Thach didn't care if they could fly inverted. He cared if they could shoot. Every pilot fired 2 0 practice rounds, more than most pre-war pilots fired in their entire training. They shot at towed targets, at radio-controlled drones, at silhouettes that popped up unexpectedly. They learned to fire in 2-second bursts. They learned to lead targets by instinct, not calculation. They learned that pretty shooting didn't matter. Hits mattered. Thach taught them the Thach weave, a defensive maneuver he'd invented, where two fighters scissored back and forth, each protecting the other's tail. It looked clumsy. Traditional pilots mocked it, but it worked. Zeros couldn't stay on a target that kept crossing in front of its wingman's guns. The weave turned mediocre pilots into dangerous teams. He taught them boom and zoom, dive on the enemy, fire one burst, extend away using superior speed, climb back to altitude, repeat, never turn, never pursue into a turning fight. If a Zero tried to turn with them, run. The Hellcat was faster in a straight line and could outdive any Japanese fighter. Use those advantages ruthlessly. Forget honor, forget fair fights, kill and survive. The training program eliminated formation flying perfection. Thatch didn't care if they flew pretty formations. He cared if they maintained mutual support. Formations were loose, flexible, practical. If a pilot got separated, he didn't try to rejoin. He went home alone. Better to lose formation discipline than lose the pilot trying to look good. Navigation training focused on one skill, getting back to the carrier. Thatch installed a new device in every training Hellcat, a simple radio compass that pointed toward the carrier's homing beacon. Pilots learned to trust the compass, not their calculations. Old-school instructors complained this made pilots lazy. Thatch countered, "A live lazy pilot is more useful than a dead navigator." The psychological training was the most radical change. Traditional fighter training emphasized aggression, attack, pursue, dominate. Thatch taught discretion. He created scenarios where the only correct answer was to run away. Pilots who pursued targets into traps failed the exercise. Pilots who broke off and escaped passed. He rewarded survival, not kills. On June 12, 1943, after 73 days of training, the 18 pilots graduated. They had 164 hours of flight time each, less than half the traditional requirement. They couldn't perform half the aerobatic maneuvers of standard pilots. Their formation flying was sloppy. By traditional standards, they weren't ready. By Thatch's standards, they were crude, practical, and deadly. The squadron deployed to the Solomon Islands on July 3, 1943. Their first combat mission came on July 11th, 8 Hellcats escorting dive bombers to Bougainville. They encountered 20 Zeros. The young pilots did exactly what Thatch taught them. They stayed together, they used the weave, they attacked in pairs, they took single bursts and extended away. In 12 minutes of combat, they shot down 7 Zeros without losing a single Hellcat. The traditional pilots at the base couldn't believe it. These rookies with 3 months of training had just shredded veteran Japanese pilots. Word spread through the Pacific Fleet like fire. Other squadrons requested Thatch's training methods. Admiral Towers ordered immediate expansion. By September 1943, every Navy fighter training program in America adopted Thatch's syllabus. Training time dropped from 18 months to 6 to 8 months. The number of pilots reaching the fleet tripled. The quality by traditional standards declined sharply. The lethality increased exponentially. The statistics told the story. In 1942, before Thatch's changes, Navy fighters had a kill ratio of 2, 5-1 against Japanese aircraft. By early 1944, after the new training took hold, the ratio climbed to 13-1. By mid-1944, during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, it peaked at 19. 119 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American fighter lost. The crude 6-month pilots were annihilating 3-year veterans. Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu was the embodiment of Thatch's philosophy. From East Chicago, Indiana, 23 years old, trained for exactly 7 months. He wasn't the best pilot in his class. He wasn't the smoothest or most precise. But on June 19, 1944, during the Marianas Turkey Shoot, Vrasiu shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes. His tactic, boom and zoom, over and over, crude and effective. Each pass took 15 seconds. Dive, fire, extend. No fancy maneuvering, no prolonged dogfights, just relentless, brutal efficiency. After the war, historians interviewed surviving Japanese pilots. They consistently reported confusion about American tactics. One pilot, Saburo Sakai, said, "American pilots in 1942 tried to fight us honorably, turn for turn. We defeated them. American pilots in 1944 fought like cowards, diving, shooting, running away. We couldn't touch them." What Sakai called cowardice, Thatch called smart. The Japanese never adapted. Their training philosophy was too deeply embedded. The few veteran pilots who survived learned to fear the Hellcat's boom and zoom tactics, but newly trained Japanese pilots in 1944-45 still received the same 3-year program emphasizing aerobatic perfection and turning dogfights. They arrived in combat, prepared for a war that no longer existed. American 6-month pilots slaughtered them. The final statistics were staggering. From 1943-1945, Navy fighters shot down 6th 477 Japanese aircraft in air-to-air combat while losing 270 fighters, a 24-1 ratio overall. The F-6F Hellcat specifically achieved a 19-1 kill ratio. Most of those victories came from pilots trained under Thatch's 6-month program. Crude pilots in excellent aircraft using simple tactics had defeated elite pilots in capable aircraft using complex tactics. Admiral Towers tried to give Thatch the Distinguished Service Medal. Thatch declined. He said the credit belonged to the kids who went out there half-trained and stayed cool enough to remember what worked. The Navy insisted. In September 1945, Thatch received the Legion of Merit for revolutionizing fighter training and contributing materially to victory in the Pacific. The citation didn't mention how many establishment officers opposed his ideas. It didn't mention the old-school instructors who called his methods barely adequate and training pilots to be mechanics, not artists. After the war, Thatch returned to his job as a routine training officer. He taught at the Naval War College for 3 years. He commanded a carrier in the 1950s. He retired in 1967 as a full admiral, not because of his training revolution, but because he served 40 years and rose through normal channels. When people asked about his legacy, he talked about the Thatch weave, not the training program. The maneuver was visible, dramatic, easy to explain. The training philosophy was subtle, bureaucratic, hard to quantify. Thatch died in 1981 in San Diego, age 75. His obituary in the New York Times was 4 paragraphs. It mentioned Midway. It mentioned the Thatch weave. It didn't mention that he'd restructured fighter training for the entire U.S. Navy and saved thousands of lives by making pilots less skillful and more deadly. The funeral was small. Family, a few former students, some Navy officials. No one gave a speech about the training revolution. Everyone talked about his tactical innovations. In 1992, a historian named Barrett Tillman was researching Hellcat combat records and noticed something odd. The dramatic improvement in kill ratios coincided not with better aircraft, but with a change in training syllabi. He tracked the change to Thatch's 1943 memo. He interviewed 47 former Hellcat pilots. One pilot, 71-year-old James Sweat from Seattle, said, "We were crude, we knew it. But we were alive and the fancy pilots who fought fair were dead." Thatch taught us that survival wasn't dishonorable. It was the whole point. Today, Thatch's training philosophy is standard in every modern Air Force. Pilots train for specific combat scenarios, not aerobatic perfection. They learn to use their aircraft's advantages and avoid its weaknesses. They train to survive first, win second. The assumption that more training equals better performance, the assumption that killed Robert Kanze and hundreds like him, is gone. Thatch proved that focused, short, practical training beats lengthy, comprehensive, traditional training when the training focuses on what actually matters. There's a small display at the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. It shows Thatch's original 47-page memo, now yellowed and fragile. Next to it is a chart showing fighter pilot training hours, 540 hours in 1942, 240 hours in 1944. Below that, another chart, kill ratio 2, 5, 1 in 1942, 19, 1 in 1944. The display doesn't explain the connection. Most visitors walk past without noticing. Those who stop and read leave understanding something profound. In war, the perfect is the enemy of the good enough, and the good enough executed immediately beats the perfect executed never. The real test of Thatch's system came not during the turkey shoot's dramatic success, but in the grinding months that followed, when the quality of Japanese opposition collapsed so completely that it threatened to expose the weaknesses of abbreviated training. By October 1944, American carriers were launching strikes against Formosa and the Philippines. The Japanese had lost most of their experienced pilots. Replacement pilots arrived with barely 100 hours of flight time, less than American pilots now received. But these poorly trained Japanese pilots flew into American formations and occasionally, through sheer numbers or luck, survived long enough to cause damage. On October 24, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Ensign Thomas Lupo from Brooklyn found himself in exactly the situation Thatch's training didn't cover. Lupo was 22, trained for 6 months at Jacksonville, in combat for 3 weeks. He'd shot down 2 aircraft using boom and zoom tactics. Everything had worked perfectly until this moment. Lupo was covering American ships when 6 Japanese torpedo bombers appeared at wave-top level, coming straight and level, no evasive maneuvers, easy targets. Thatch's training said, dive on them, fire, extend away. But Lupo saw something his limited experience couldn't process. One bomber's canopy was shattered, the pilot clearly dead or dying, but the aircraft continued straight toward the fleet on autopilot, or through the last spasms of a dying man's hands. Lupo dove, fired a burst, saw his tracers strike the bomber's wing. Nothing happened. The bomber kept coming. Lupo's training said extend away now. Don't pursue, don't maneuver, regain altitude. But the bomber was 800 yards from the light carrier USS Princeton. Lupo violated everything he'd learned. He stayed low, turned to pursue, fired another burst. The bomber's left engine caught fire. The aircraft veered slightly, but continued toward Princeton. Lupo closed to 300 yards, suicidally close by Hellcat doctrine. He fired until his guns emptied. The bomber exploded 200 yards from Princeton, close enough that fragments hit the carrier's deck. Lupo pulled up through the debris cloud, his windscreen covered in oil and blood. He'd saved the carrier. He'd also nearly killed himself by violating every survival principle Thatch taught. Back on the carrier, Lupo's squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander Paul Bowie, watched the gun camera footage 3 times. Then he called Lupo into his office. The smell of engine oil and sweat filled the cramped space. Bowie was 29 from Oklahoma City, trained in the old 18-month program before Thatch's changes. He'd survived 40 missions by following doctrine religiously. He looked at Lupo for a long moment. "You broke every rule," B said. "Yes, sir," Lupo replied. "You should be dead." "Yes, sir." "You saved Princeton." Lupo said nothing. Bai leaned back in his chair. Thatch's training teaches you to survive, but Thatch never addressed what happens when survival isn't enough, when you have to choose between living and the mission. He paused. The old training covered this. We learned that sometimes a fighter pilot's job is to die buying time or saving ships. Thatch's program doesn't teach that, because Thatch believed dead pilots are useless. But you're not useless if you die stopping a torpedo that would kill 700 sailors. This tension between Thatch's survival-first doctrine and the traditional warrior ethos created unexpected friction in late 1944. As Japanese opposition weakened, American pilots trained in pure survival tactics sometimes hesitated to take necessary risks. They'd been taught so thoroughly to avoid danger that when danger was required, they struggled with the decision. The Navy noticed this problem in December 1944 when analyzing gun camera footage from the Philippine campaigns. Pilots trained under Thatch's system showed a 34% higher survival rate than traditionally trained pilots. But they also showed an 18% lower rate of pressing attacks against ground targets, attacks that required flying low and slow through anti-aircraft fire. The crude, survival-focused training produced pilots who excelled in air-to-air combat where boom and zoom worked. It produced pilots who hesitated in ground attack where you had to fly into the bullets. Admiral William Halsey, commanding 3rd Fleet, wrote to Admiral Towers in January 1945, "Thatch's pilots win dogfights, but when I need someone to fly into a steel cloud and destroy a bridge, I want a pilot trained the old way, a pilot who believes dying gloriously is acceptable." This wasn't criticism of Thatch's program. It was recognition that different missions required different psychology. Towers forwarded Halsey's letter to Thatch with a note. "Your methods saved thousands in air combat. Can we modify them to create pilots who know when not to survive?" Thatch spent 2 weeks formulating a response. His answer, dated January 29, 1945, was blunt. "No. The Navy must decide whether it's training survivors or martyrs. I built a system to train survivors. If the Navy needs martyrs, use a different system for that mission. This philosophical divide led to an unexpected compromise. In February 1945, the Navy split fighter training into two tracks. Track 1 used Thatcher's 6-month program, pure air-to-air, survival-focused, high-volume production. These pilots went to fleet carriers and combat air patrol duties. Track 2 used a modified 9-month program, combining Thatcher's practical approach with traditional warrior ethos training. These pilots went to close air support squadrons, where pressing attacks mattered more than survival rates. The two-track system worked, but it revealed something Thatch had tried to avoid acknowledging. War required both survivors and martyrs, both crude efficiency and noble sacrifice. His genius was maximizing survivors in contexts where survival was possible. But he'd never solved the harder problem: how to train someone to die well when dying was necessary. Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Dosay understood this tension better than most. Dosay was from a small farm outside Chattanooga, Tennessee. 24 years old, trained for 8 months in the transitional period when the Navy was experimenting with hybrid programs. He received Thatcher's survival tactics plus 40 additional hours of what instructors called mission-first training. Scenarios where the correct answer was to sacrifice yourself. On April 6, 1945, during Operation Iceberg off Okinawa, Dosay faced the choice Bowie had described to Lupo. A kamikaze broke through the combat air patrol and dove toward the destroyer USS Leutze. Dosay was at 8,000 feet, too high for a clean intercept. Thatcher's training said, "Don't dive vertically, you'll black out or lose control. Stay alive, there will be other chances." The mission-first training said, "If you don't dive now, 300 sailors die." Dosay pushed his Hellcat into a near-vertical dive. He blacked out at 6,000 feet from G-forces. He regained consciousness at 2,000 feet, the kamikaze still ahead, but closer. He fired blind, barely conscious. His burst hit the kamikaze's tail. The aircraft veered, missed Leutze by 30 feet, exploded in the water. Dosay pulled out at 400 feet, his vision still tunneled, his Hellcat's airframe stressed beyond limits. He made it back to the carrier, landed and collapsed in the cockpit. Dosay's gun camera footage became required viewing in the hybrid training program. Instructors showed it to new pilots with this narration. Ensign Dosay broke every survival rule. He lived because his aircraft held together and because he was lucky. Most pilots who do this die. But Leutze survived because Dosay chose the mission over survival. You need to know both ways, when to survive and when to sacrifice. Knowing the difference is what separates crude survivors from complete fighter pilots. By May 1945, the Navy had refined the system. 6-month Thatch method pilots for fleet defense, 9-month hybrid pilots for close support and kamikaze defense. The statistics validated the approach. Fleet defense pilots maintained 19 1-kill ratios with 3% losses. Close support pilots had 8 1-kill ratios with 12% losses, but completed 89% of assigned strikes. Different missions, different training, different acceptable casualties. Thatch watched this evolution with mixed feelings. He'd proven that abbreviated, focused training produced effective fighter pilots. But the Navy's addition of mission-first training to create pilots willing to die contradicted his core belief that survival enabled victory. In a letter to his wife in June 1945, Thatch wrote, "I taught boys to live. The Navy added instructions on how to die. Both are necessary. I'm not sure how I feel about that." The war ended before the hybrid system fully matured. In August 1945, when Japan surrendered, the Navy had 6,847 fighter pilots in the Pacific, 200 trained under pure Thatch methods, 100 in the hybrid program, 547 remaining from pre-war traditional training. The survival statistics were stark. Thatch-trained pilots, 94% survival rate. Hybrid-trained pilots, 88% survival rate. Traditionally trained pilots, 71% survival rate. But mission completion rates told another story. Thatch pilots, 78% of assigned missions fully completed. Hybrid pilots, 89% completed. Traditional pilots, 91% completed. The old-school pilots died more often, but they finished what they started more reliably. Crewed survivors accomplished less per mission than cultured warriors, even though survivors lived to fly again. After the war, this data disappeared into classified files. The Navy didn't want to publicly acknowledge the trade-off between survival and mission completion. Official histories celebrated Thatch's revolution without mentioning the limits of survival-first training. The message was clear: Thatch's methods won the war. The nuances, when survival wasn't enough, when dying was necessary, remained unspoken. The final chapter of Thatch's training legacy emerged not from World War II, but from Korea. In 1950, when the Navy needed fighter pilots again, it defaulted to Thatch's 6-month program. Pilots trained in survival tactics went to Korea and faced a new enemy: MiG-15 jets flown by Soviet and Chinese pilots. The MiGs were faster than anything American pilots had fought. Boom and zoom didn't work. MiGs could extend away faster than F-9F Panthers could pursue. Young pilots trained in Thatch's methods found themselves in turning dogfights they'd been taught to avoid. Lieutenant Junior Grade Royce Williams from Minnesota, 6 months out of training, engaged 7 MiGs alone in November 1952. The fight lasted 35 minutes, an eternity in jet combat. Williams shot down 4 MiGs using improvised tactics that violated every survival principle. He turned with MiGs he should have run from. He stayed in the fight when he should have disengaged. He survived through skill, luck, and the willingness to ignore his training when his training no longer applied. After landing, Williams was debriefed by a training officer who'd served under Thatch in World War II. The officer asked, "Why didn't you disengage when the MiGs had an altitude advantage?" Williams replied, "Because they would have shot down the photo reconnaissance plane I was escorting. My job was to protect that plane, not survive." The training officer wrote in his report, "Lieutenant Williams succeeded by violating the survival-first doctrine that defines modern fighter training. His success suggests that Thatch's methods, while revolutionary for World War II, may require modification for jet combat, where disengagement isn't always possible." This report reached Thatch, now a Rear Admiral serving at the Pentagon. Thatch read the report twice, then filed it without comment. He never publicly addressed whether his training philosophy needed updating for jets, but in private conversations with fellow officers, he acknowledged that he'd optimized for a specific context: propeller fighters in the Pacific, 1943-1945. He'd never claimed his methods would work forever or everywhere. War changed. Training had to change with it. The irony was that by 1953, Thatch's survival-first philosophy had become so embedded in Navy culture that it was difficult to modify. A generation of instructors had learned that survival was the paramount goal. Teaching pilots when to die, when to press attacks despite the risk, felt like betrayal of Thatch's legacy. But jet combat required exactly this flexibility, knowing when boom and zoom worked and when you had to turn and fight despite the danger. In 1954, the Navy commissioned a study, Fighter Training Effectiveness, 1940-1953. The classified report ran 847 pages. One section analyzed Thatch's contribution. The conclusion: Commander Thatch solved the immediate crisis of 1943, insufficient pilots facing superior enemy training. His methods produced adequate pilots in sufficient numbers to achieve air superiority. However, adequacy is context-dependent. What was adequate in 1943 may be inadequate in 1953. The challenge for modern training is preserving Thatch's efficiency while restoring flexibility in tactical decision-making. Thatch retired in 1967 without seeing this report. It remained classified until 1983, 2 years after his death. When historians finally accessed the file, they found handwritten notes in the margins, Thatch's notes added during a review in 1958. Next to the conclusion about adequacy being context-dependent, Thatch had written, "Correct. I trained boys to survive a specific war. The next war will require different training. The principle remains: train for what matters, cut what doesn't. What matters changes." This pragmatic wisdom, that training must adapt to circumstances, that yesterday's innovation becomes tomorrow's orthodoxy, was perhaps Thatcher's most important legacy. He didn't create a permanent system. He created a method for thinking about training, identify what actually matters in combat, focus training on those skills, eliminate everything else, accept imperfection in service of effectiveness. Modern fighter pilot training still reflects this philosophy, though few instructors know Thatcher's name. The Navy trains pilots in 18 months now, longer than Thatcher's 6 months, but shorter than the pre-war 24 months. The time is spent differently. More simulators, more scenario-based training, more focus on decision-making under stress. The aerobatic perfection of the 1930s is gone. The mission-first sacrifice training of 1945 is gone. What remains is Thatcher's core insight. Train for the war you're fighting, not the war you imagine or the war you wish you were fighting. In 2003, during the Iraq War, a Navy FA-18 pilot named Lieutenant Nathan White engaged Iraqi fighters using tactics his instructors had taught, tactics that traced directly to Thatcher's 1943 innovations. White didn't know this history. He just knew that tactics worked. After the engagement, his squadron commander showed him grainy footage from 1944, Alex Vratiu shooting down 6 planes in 8 minutes using nearly identical tactics. White watched the 60-year-old footage and said, "He flies exactly like we do. Same patterns, same discipline." That continuity, crude effectiveness persisting across generations, was the measure of Thatcher's impact. He hadn't taught perfection. He'd taught what worked, and what worked in 1944 still worked in 2003 because Thatch had focused on fundamentals that transcended technology. Use your aircraft's advantages, avoid its weaknesses, survive to fight again, stay simple, stay effective. If Thatcher's training revolution teaches us anything beyond fighter tactics, it's this: in any crisis requiring rapid scaling, perfection is the enemy of adequacy. The 18-month training program of 1942 was perfect for peacetime, inadequate for war. The 6-month program was imperfect for everything, but adequate for what mattered, keeping pilots alive long enough to win. Sometimes crude and immediate beats perfect and delayed. Sometimes good enough right now beats excellent eventually. The men Thatch trained, crude, unpolished, deadly, won the Pacific not because they were the best pilots, but because they were good enough pilots in sufficient numbers, armed with tactics that worked. They survived not because they were skilled, but because they were smart. They won not through individual brilliance, but through collective adequacy scaled to overwhelming advantage. That was Thatcher's genius, understanding that war is won not by heroes, but by masses of adequately trained people doing simple things effectively. If this story moved you, hit that like button to honor Commander Thatch and the crude, effective, half-trained pilots who won the Pacific. Subscribe to keep these forgotten innovations alive, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Did someone in your family serve as a pilot? What's your connection to this war? We have viewers from Pensacola to Perth, and we want to hear your story. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. These men didn't die for glory, they lived by being smart. That deserves to be remembered.